introduce Emma Pennington, who's an old friend of mine. She's an Anglican parish priest out at Giles Horsepath and Cudston. Can you hear me now? Right. She's not Emma's going to talk about what it is to live the Benedictine way of life outside the cloister.
Something like that. Well, thank you. Can you all hear me? Because I do have, I've been known to have quite a quiet voice. So if at any point I've gone quiet on you, can you just wave at me and I'll try and pick it up? Yeah, please do, because it is one of my failures to get a little bit passionate and get a little bit quiet when you do that. Well, it's really lovely to be with you, and I've completely underestimated how many would be here. I knew Esther de Bow would draw folk, so I've only brought 20 of the handouts. And really, all they are is just so that you have the text in front of you, because we're going to look at one particular chapter of Benedict's rule to help us think about his rule outside the cloister. So you can always go back and read it for yourself, or I will read it out during the talk. I'd like to begin with a very interesting piece that I found on a website, no less, of course, that's the way we communicate today, which was called vocations.com. I'm going to read it out to you. Some of you will have it in front of you. It's number 1 on the handout. For those of you who don't. Mary asks, I spoke to a parish priest whom I have known for a long time. When I explained that I was trying to discern between a contemplative or a more active apostolate, he told me that he thought that a strictly contemplative lifestyle was selfish and self-absorbed, and I needed to get out among the people to do anything of value. I reminded him that many of the great saints were cloistered contemplatives, but he thought that these are different times which call for people to use their voices and their skills out in society. I suppose that many people do not see the value of the cloistered contemplative lifestyle. I still feel a pull in both directions. On a given day, I think that I would be perfectly content to worship God in a contemplative lifestyle. Then, on the following day, when I'm reminded, e.g. by listening to the slanted viewpoints on the evening news, of the very serious moral problems present in our society, I feel that maybe God needs more people to do something active. This is what the website advises her to do. Dear Mary, don't worry, the contemplative vocation is not only a valid way to give your life to God. Today it is of especial vital importance for the Church. You don't have to have a contemplative vocation to know and appreciate that. The active vocation is necessary today, not because it is more important than a contemplative, but because the Church is a body and each member has a different function to fulfill. Each member needs religious, the actives need contemplatives, and the contemplatives need actives, so that their prayer will have an instrument to make it bear fruit. Continue as you are going, putting everything in God's hands and doing all that depends on you, so that His grace will have something to work with. The search will purify you and will allow Him to speak to you more clearly. He knows what He wants you to do. Now, to me, this email, this answer, this whole piece from the internet and its reply seems to me to encapsulate the kind of muddle that we seem to have got into today. Following the biblical precedents of Martha and Mary, the life of prayer and the life of action have come to primarily be understood as kind of lifestyle choices which are invariably mutually exclusive to one another. What is worse, they've actually become, for someone like Mary, warring factions within her soul. One day, do I live a lifestyle of prayer, where I would be perfectly content to worship God, she says, or do I confront the serious moral problems in our society? Do I work as an actor to promote God's mission and work in the world? These seem to be the two choices laid before Mary, or actually more seriously, seem to be tearing her apart. I don't know if you've ever seen the film The Matrix. In the first film, the poor Nemo is offered two pills, a blue pill or a red pill. Which pill are you going to choose? Do you want to go on in your life of basically illusions, or are you going to take the red pill and find out what life is really about? And actually, it's not very nice. So she seems to be offered two pills. She can't decide between each of them. The advice she is given doesn't entirely help her. I think we will pass swiftly over what the parish priest says. You'll be lucky, you'll be very relieved to know that not all parish priests would tell her that the contemplative lifestyle is selfish and self-absorbed. And look instead at what the vocations.com say. And in many ways, they reinforce what Mary thinks about these two lifestyles. They may well be integral to the body of the church, as he says, and to each other, but they're still mutually exclusive. At the end of the day, Mary will need to choose between them in order to do God's will. I remember a long time ago seeing a picture. It was one of those wonderful Victorian pictures, and it showed a lovely cottage with a beautiful young lady sitting, bouncing a toddler on her knee, and just outside the cottage window, a nun ran past with her head over the shoulder, looking in at the other vocation. I'm not sure that Mary is alone in that her search to live an authentic Christian life has resulted in coming up against this seeming dichotomy between the life of prayer and between the life of action. I don't think you need to have a contemplative vocation to yearn for some silence, some stillness in the business of life, rushing around, collecting the children, going to work, doing all the things we have to do in service to others. And of course, in our world of immediate access and instant response, times of prayer can so easily be distracted, be interrupted, be ruined in many cases. And yet, faced with the great needs of others, time apart can sometimes feel like it's a hellish indulgence, an exercise of personal reflection and self-indulgence rather than that space, that renewal, that refreshing, which is what prayer is meant to be about. The tears of a child and the difficulty of organising time apart can so easily result in that question, why am I doing this? Like Mary, we seem to be tearing ourselves apart between the business of prayer and the business of life. Now, in many ways, we could, if we wanted to, point a finger at Benedict for this spiritual muddle. Despite their desire to go back to the basics of Benedict's rule, the Cistercian order developed a new class of monks known as the lay brothers, who often came from a very poor background, generally illiterate, and did much of the manual work of the abbey. As the monasteries grew into very successful businesses in the 11th and 12th century, their role as land managers as well as labourers became increasingly important. They lived similar, but they lived very separate lives from the choir monks, the monks who studied, the monks who prayed. They took similar vows, but they attended much fewer church services. They often lived away from the mother house on the granges which the monastery owned, at some distance away often. The two-tier system of those who prayed and those who worked, though a simplification of their actual life, has, however, seeped into our national and spiritual consciousness, so that folk in the parish will often say, I have but a simple faith. You and the religious are the ones who pray. More influential, perhaps, is the scripture story of Martha and Mary, interpreted from earliest times as representing these two lives, the life of prayerful contemplation and the life of active service. It runs through the history of the church and is immortalised in stone and in glass. In All Saints Church in Cuddesdon, we have our own Martha and Mary window. It shows Jesus on the left with his hand raised in blessing in one of the lights of the window. And he looks down at Mary, who is in the other light, who gazes up at him. She's kneeling before him. She gazes up, caught up, it seems, as if in a mystical trance of prayer, consumed by her gaze and oblivious to all around her. She absolutely represents the contemplative ideal. Separated by a wall behind her is Martha, who seems to be in a passage that is actually outside the room. And she holds in her hand a tray with a bottle on it and also some cups. Now she too is looking at Jesus, but her gaze is very different, because her gaze is the gaze of instant recognition, instant absorption. Her whole body is moving forward as if she is off in service, and her head is just over her shoulder as if she's suddenly seen Jesus and caught up in what he says. This Victorian window wonderfully captures the biblical story and those words of Jesus, that Mary, of course, has chosen the better part. Now, the priest may well tell our Mary that the contemplative lifestyle is selfish and self-absorbed, but the spiritual tradition tells us otherwise, and it is the life of action and work which is often seen as the distraction from that of prayer. Once again, Martha and Mary may well be sisters, but they are still warring ones. So it's absolutely remarkable, therefore, what we find when we turn to one boring little chapter in Benedict's rule, one that I suspect a lot of people have passed over. It's chapter 48. Now, commentators have described this chapter on daily manual labour as one in which Benedict sanctifies the life of work by bringing into the daily ebb and flow of prayer and spiritual reading, so that all aspects of life become, as he says, like prayer without ceasing. For a world absorbed by its work status, crushed by the indignity of lack of employment, this wise commentary is very helpful, and it enables us to see our labours, our active life in the context of prayer. Even with the possibility that our active lives could become prayer. It takes what is said in the oratory, in the time of silence, in the time of devotion, out into the fields, and sanctifies our work. This is invariably how commentators have seen this chapter. However, I believe that Benedict is saying something much more radical in this chapter, which smashes our notion of a dichotomy between the active and the contemplative life, the life of work and the life of prayer. And he reconciles them into one lifestyle. And surprisingly, that lifestyle is the lifestyle of virtue, of holiness, which is not restricted to those who live in a monastery, but actually lies at the heart of every Christian vocation. It's slightly long, but I will now read to you the chapter because it's worth hearing. Idleness is the enemy of the soul. Therefore, all the community should have specified periods of manual labour, as well as for prayerful reading. We believe that the times for both may be arranged as follows. From Easter to the 1st of October, they will spend their mornings after prime till about the 4th hour at whatever work needs to be done. From the 4th hour until the time of sext, they will devote themselves to reading. But after sext and their meal, they may rest on their beds in complete silence. Should any wish to read privately, let them do so, but without disturbing the others. They should say noon a little early, about midway through the 8th hour, and then until Vespers they are to return to whatever work is necessary. They must not become distressed if local conditions or their poverty should force them to do the harvesting themselves. When they live by the labour of their hands, as our predecessors and the apostles did, they will really be in the best monastic tradition. Yet all things are to be done with moderation on account of the faint-hearted. From the 1st of October until the beginning of Lent, the members of the community ought to devote themselves to reading until the end of the 2nd hour. At this time, Terces said, and they are to work at their assigned tasks until noon. At the first signal for the hour of noon, all put aside their work to be ready for the second signal. Then, after their meal, they will devote themselves to their reading or to the Psalms. During the days of Lent, they should be free in the morning to read until the 3rd hour, after which they will work at their assigned tasks until the end of the 10th hour. During this time of Lent, each one is to receive a book from the library and is to read the whole of it straight through. These books are to be distributed at the beginning of Lent. It is very important that 1 or 2 seniors be deputed to make the rounds of the monastery, while the members of the community are reading. Their duty is to see that no one is so apathetic as to waste time or engage in idle talk to the neglect of the reading, and so not only harm themselves but also distract others. If any such are found, which God forbid, they should be reproved at a first and second time. If they do not amend, they must be subjected to the punishment of the rule as a warning to others. Further, it is always wrong for members of the community to associate with each other at times when this is not appropriate. On Sunday, all are to be engaged in reading except those who have been assigned various duties. If any are so remiss and indolent that they are unwilling or unable to study or read, they are to be given some work in order that they may not be idle. Those who are sick or weak should be given a type of work or craft that will keep them busy without overwhelming them or driving them away. The the abbot must take their infirmities into account. In many ways, the title to this chapter is somewhat misleading, because with it, Benedict is not actually talking about the spirituality of work, how work can be an offering of service and prayer, an act of charity. There is none of that detail that we find in his description, say, of the role of the cellarer or of the care of tools. He doesn't tell us how to behave, to be Christ-like in our times of labour, even though his call to live by the labour of their hands is an extremely countercultural one. In Benedict's day, of course, it was only the slaves who would actually do any manual labour at all. Now, maybe this is because he sees work as a necessity, something which the community cannot escape from. Even monks and nuns have to eat. But I think not. Instead, this chapter is all about the day-to-day business of life, how we can possibly live out our Christian calling, which is for him both a contemplative calling of prayer and study, as well as the active call to service and labour. Benedict knew very well how hard this can be, and so he gives to his community a very clear scaffolding which marks out distinct times for prayer, times for study, and times for work. For, of course, we all know in this Hamlet city that study is especially important, because without reading and reflection, we cannot possibly grow. What is remarkable, though, is that he does not give precedence to any one of them. All are of equal importance. So the community is to pray from 2 until dawn, then work for a couple of hours till terce at 10ish, then read till lunch at midday and sext, rest or read till 2:30, back to work for 3 or 4 hours till vespers and supper in the late afternoon before compline and bed. And of course, with good Benedictine compassion, he makes allowances for those who find this too difficult, and he shifts the times depending on the light. It's often said that Benedictine life is all about balance, getting the balance right. But actually, in many ways, Benedict's day that he describes here is not particularly balanced. The best parts of the day are given to manual labour, and prayer is to be brief, to punctuate the day, to be the breaths drawn between the words. Rather, I would say that this chapter is all about routine. A very dull little word, I know, but which many of us hate. But it's the word that makes a child feel happy and secure. It's the word that gives me some sense of control on my life. It's the word that for Benedict enables us to see that the times of work and service are not secondary or separate from the times of prayer and reading, but each one is as important to the human soul as it's sometimes something as mundane, as routine, that liberates us and enables us to live the life of holiness. Now, this life of holiness, Benedict makes very clear from the beginning of the chapter. It's often the way with Benedict that his most profound comments are very small and simple and begin a discussion. And as such, they can easily be overlooked. Now, this chapter is no less an example, for he begins with the words, "Idleness is the enemy of the soul." Short, which can easily be passed over. But these few words propel us into the moral life, the world of virtues and vices, where the soul must be cultivated and cleansed in its process of searching for God. And what I find interesting is that Benedict does not go on to describe how work is the remedy for idleness, sloth, laziness, or lounging about. That is maybe what we would expect. Instead, he talks about routine, the place of work and prayerful reading in relation to each other. Work within this routine prevents the soul from the sin of idleness. But when in relation to spiritual reading, it does something else too, which we can see if we consider the sin of idleness a little closer. Now, the sin of sloth, of all the 7 deadly sins, is perhaps the one we see of least significance. We all deserve a good chill out, a bit of me time. Idleness is accepted if you have a very busy lifestyle or exhausted all the time. It's even become part of what it means to be a teenager these days. But our modern permissive understanding of the sin of sloth has wandered far from its monastic roots. For Benedict and the early fathers, sloth was essentially acedia, or spiritual apathy. It was that temptation to speed through prayers, skip chapters of a holy book, sort of lethargic boredom that killed the soul. Easily distracted, acedia caused the soul to look for any escape route from prayer. A knock on the door, a phone call, washing that needs to be hung out, a cat that needs to be fed. Benedict sees it coming not from within, of course, but from without, from the enemy of the soul. And his solution, his remedy, is routine, a time of work which equips the soul for a time of prayer, and a time of prayer which undergirds the time of work. So for Benedict, there is in fact no active lifestyle or contemplative lifestyle. There is only the life of virtue, the life of holiness, the life which seeks to know God. For many who have lived outside and inside the monastery, his rule and this seemingly dull chapter on routine has enabled them to have a structure, a scaffold on which to build their temple of holiness to the Lord. But for those of us who still struggle and feel we live in a chaos of sticks and stones, I'd like to leave you with some words from a 14th century writer, Walter Hilton. Originally he wrote for an enclosed nun, but his words became increasingly popular amongst a burgeoning lay audience who sought to live the life of prayer in their ordinary active lives. And in one of his texts called The Mixed Life, he tries to show that there is a third way. There is the medleyed way, the way of the mixed life. And he gives this piece of advice, which sounds remarkably familiar. If you are taken from your devotion when you would rather be still, either by children or by servants or by any of your fellow Christians, for their profit or for the ease of their heart, do not be angry with them, nor distressed, but lightly leave your devotion, whether it be prayer or meditation, and go and do the service to your fellow Christian, as readily as our Lord himself did so for you, and meekly suffer of him. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Emma. Are there any questions that anyone would like to ask Emma?
I'd like to ask you to talk about prayer on your own. I want to know, do you ever have, you're not necessarily in touch with the outer world, where the awful things that are going on, maybe you are or not, and do you ever have times when you are all praying for some, say, disaster or something together? That's what I would really like to say, so that you get a real volume of prayer.
I think that's a very interesting comment, because in a sense, when we pray, prayer can often be a very self-absorbed thing, can't it? We pray. But I guess when we come together in the church, and we pray together, and we bring all the stuff of our lives into that space of prayer, but we also bring all the things that are happening in the world into that space of prayer. So it's interesting how the life of prayer and the life of what we do outside the church and the life of action actually come into one forum in worship, which we can then offer up to God.
To what extent, though, are you in touch with, do you hear about what's going on outside?
What, me personally?
No, within the what's called a convent.
Well, I mean, I don't know that, I can't answer that question, but I do remember reading something about Sister Wendy Beckett, who's the hermit who wrote all those wonderful books on art. I read one of her books and I remember distinctly, I thought it was amazing that the first thing she does, she gets up very early in the morning and prays, and then she goes over to the convent from her little hermitage, and she sits down and there is a paper set aside for her with Wendy on the top, and then for the next 2 hours she reads that paper through and prays it. And I thought, gosh, she probably knows more about what's going on in the outside world than I do, we listen to Radio 4. So, yeah, I think they're
So that is allowed?
I think there's that deep praying for the world that many monks and nuns see themselves as, through their prayer, sustaining the world. And that's always been my perception of their vocation, that their vocation is actually an amazing vocation to sustain us all. And often I find myself on those days when it's quite tough in the parish and life, that someone somewhere is holding me in prayer. So that's an amazing sort of active vocation within their contemplative lifestyle. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you.
I wonder if I could just come in on that, because I was religious for some time.
Yes.
And just give a very specific example. When they were coming up to the first elections in South Africa and all that dismantling apartheid, Desmond Tutu, as Archbishop of Cape Town, wrote to all religious communities in the Anglican Communion with very specific things that needed to be prayed for. And my guess is that similar things that we have no clue about.
Yeah.
I mean, I also just pose the question is, do you actually need to know the specifics in order to be holy before God? I mean, that's an interesting question in itself, isn't it, in terms of prayer?
Yes.
So, I hope you don't mind me coming in on that, but...
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. Yes.
I'm just, on a different tack, just go back to Mary and Martha.
Yes.
Just an observation, really. I think it's fascinating to put that story in Luke. In together with Joy 11, with the conversation at Lazarus' grave, when it's actually Martha who's talking theology to Jesus. And I think when you hold those two stories together, you get quite a different perspective on what's going on.
That's very, very, very helpful. Yes.
My question is, I know it's related to the monastery, but how you possible to apply this rule to the family? This is the basic of the society. And particularly how you imagine to encourage the individualism of the family, just in the family. How you individualism in the monastery. And at the same time you have to obey the rule. And how is it working? Because sometimes in family it's very difficult to keep it there.
In the family?
Yes. How would you see the Benedict rule applied to the family? How is the basic principle?
I think that's...
I'm repeating again correctly. Individualism in the monastery. Each monarch is different. Personality, character, I don't know. God made us all the different. How is it?
Thank you. I found it quite, myself, I found it quite liberating to think of that structure of the day, the structuring of the day in terms of routine. Because in my family, we live on routine. We all know when the children know when it's breakfast time, we know when we have to be at certain places. So having that kind of, well, that's also in the Benedictine rule, that it then enables maybe Benedict's rule of life to not be so very different, to not be so very far away from actually the life that I am living now. And also it starts to bridge a gap. It's like, well, of course, monastery, they have a very strict timetable and everything, and I can't possibly have that in my own home. But they have routine, and I have routine. So, where is it that I can then enable in my own routine, work out myself, those bits of prayer, those bits of action, those bits of looking after people, so that maybe I can live that more authentic Christian life which he calls us to. But I found it quite helpful just seeing that Benedict's rule of life was not so very different from the fundamental stuff, structure that I have in my own life, which is this kind of, we all have routines. Does that kind of answer?
Thank you very much. I was talking recently about Benedictine spirituality to some Baptists, and a woman mentioned that actually being a monk is not what we commonly do in these days because it works exactly this time. And I tried to suggest to her that she tried to look at the difference between the vocation of the monastic life and the ethos which underline it, which undergird it, which seems to be what we're talking about here. Could you give us any comments as to how we actually make that distinction between what we see in the rules of the monastic life and actually determine what the ethos is that is undergirding that life so that it can be carried into everyday life?
Well, I'm not someone who actually lives a monastic life. I would have to say that I couldn't speak authentically about what is the true ethos that the monks and monastic lifestyle would live by. I mean, I think that answer would have to come from someone who lives that vocation rather than someone who doesn't. But I think what I can say is that someone who has a very busy life as a parish priest and with a family, and yet also has a kind of contemplative monastic heart, I think that a lot of us, well, maybe presumptive saying that, I think a lot of us do find that the rule of Benedict and the spirituality of prayer is incredibly important, and that, you know, it's not that we go to see our betters in a monastery, but somehow that they together in dialogue, they help us live our Christian vocation. Because I do believe that every vocation is entirely unique. I think when we start saying, oh, well, your vocation is a parish priest, or your vocation is to be a monk, or your vocation is to be this, I have often found that quite restricting. I think my vocation is to be Emma Pennington, and I think that's the hardest bit to try and find out. So I think it's the dialogue we have with monastics who live that enclosed life, and us who live in the reality of that contemplative heart is the way that we explore the future, I think, and how we can be authentic.
Just in the structure of that reply, I think you have part of the answer, which is that of humility, which is very integral to Benedictine spirituality. She couldn't give you the answer because she didn't know, and she knew that. Would anyone else like to ask a question?
Regards Martha and Mary,
Yes.
I wonder whether you see the Mediaeval glass in the University College Chapel, where Martha showed an enormous label and one next to Steve. As regards John 11, which we have quoted just now, in John 12, Martha serves, and it is Mary who takes a spike on our ointment and bathes Jesus' feet. Whereas in 11, Martha, the practical one, points out that Lazarus already stinketh, but Mary was the one who goes to the tomb.
I think there's some very good passages to kind of go and chew over in lecture. Thank you very much.
How much
I'll tell you what, I can tell you what it's like to be a parish priest, if you like. But, I don't know, or maybe someone who lived the monastic life must try. It was how hard was the monastic life? This lady lived that she was originally in a community.
I think I just want to answer that by giving you a comment I overheard by a parish group who had come to the convent and they didn't realise I was listening in. And one lady said to another, "They're very ordinary, aren't they?" And I didn't have the nerve to ask her whether she was relieved or disappointed. And I think the point is, and I'd like to pick up really what Emma said, your vocation is to be who you are before God. And if your vocation is to a monastic life, and that's who you are going to be, who you are meant to be, then it will have its joys and its difficulties as any other life would have. So I'm not sure it's a question that can be answered in the abstract. Does that make sense? I think all life has its difficulty and all life has its joys.
Can I answer it from a perspective of observing monks and nuns over years? I used to live in Wantage, and the Wantage sisters were part of my life because they wandered up and down the street where I lived, and I got to know them. And most of those nuns that I got to know were probably in their 70s and 80s. You would have thought that they were 25, and you would have thought that they were thoroughly involved in business or some really heartland part of our society. They were well informed, very, very full of life, and were able to giggle. That's what I think monastic life can give you. And they also said it's very hard living that closely to one another. So it's not easy, but it's in reality of life. That's what I saw amongst those then about 100 nuns. Do you want to end with a story? That's one that's... Emma ended, and I just wanted to end with this story. Do you know the story about the monk who was in his cell, and he was so enraptured with his prayer that he had a vision of Virgin Mary given to him. And then he heard a knock on the door. He's really, really irritated. So he thought, what do I do? What do I do? And in the end, he decided to go and answer the door and deal with the person whose question it was. And he came back and thought, I'll get back to my prayers, but the vision will have gone. It wasn't. It was there. He said, it's amazing, you're here still. I said, well, if you hadn't have gone to the door, I would have. Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you.
Very much indeed. Just a couple of things before you leave. If I may remind you, we do need some support financially in order for these talks to happen. So if you were able to donate something, that would be great. Next week we have Michael Woodward coming. He's elected lay leader of the Benedictine community, dispersed community. And he is willing to do a session on Lectio Divina after the talk with a few minutes break. I know a lot of you have to go back to work, but if you were free to experience that from somebody who really knows what they're doing and has taught a lot of people now, groups and individuals as well, then you'd be most welcome. Those of us who were fortunate enough to be able to go to the Gregorian chant Vespers at St. Bennett's last Thursday, I'm still floating, as it were. It was so utterly beautiful. So thank you, Father Michael, for inviting us. And I think that's all I have to say, except thank you very much for coming. Please continue to support this venture. Thank you.